I remember the way sunlight filtered through the windshield as we drove along State Route 33 toward Hocking Hills. The scenery outside looked idyllic, rolling hills merging into dense pockets of trees, a portrait of late summer beauty in Ohio. The air in the car felt heavy with anticipation because of the stories Marcus had been sharing since we left Cleveland that morning. He had a knack for stirring up excitement with his dark tales of forest spirits and ghost sightings, and although I tried to dismiss them as folklore, I could sense the growing apprehension in the small confines of my Subaru. Sarah, seated in the back to my right, kept twisting the silver ring on her finger and glancing out the window, while Lila, directly behind me, alternated between dozing off and occasionally snorting awake at some remark Marcus made from the front passenger seat. It was a stark contrast. Marcus brimming with excited energy, Sarah looking worried, Lila focusing on rest, and me, Evan Collins, just trying not to let Marcus's local legend mania push my imagination into dark places. The plan to camp in Hocking Hills had been Marcus's idea, sprung on us after our last group outing to Cuyahoga Valley National Park. That trip had been entirely peaceful. Picturesque waterfalls, easy trails, no reason to suspect that another camping venture would open some hidden door to terror. But Marcus loved a good thrill, and he was always searching for the next rumor of supernatural happenings. He'd read about strange footprints, sightings of humanoid creatures, and old local legends about vanished people in the Hocking Hills region. For weeks, he'd peppered our group chat with cryptic references. Did you know people used to see black-eyed children near the caves? Or, some folks claim to hear voices mimicking them at night, never once dropping the grin on his face as he typed. Sarah had openly admitted that the stories creeped her out, while Lila just laughed them off, but we'd all agreed to come along. Part of me still thinks it was that natural human curiosity to face something unknown. We decided to stop in Athens for a quick meal and to stock up on last-minute supplies. Athens had its own haunted reputation, especially around the university, with rumored spirits wandering old dorm rooms and an abandoned asylum. None of us believed in that wholeheartedly, but the stories gave a certain vibe to the small college town. We parked near Court Street and went into a little diner. A waitress with a friendly lined face served us our sandwiches and coffee, but her demeanor shifted when Marcus mentioned we were headed to Hocking Hills to camp. She didn't say much, just, with a slight frown. Then, on our way out, an old man with a gray flannel shirt and a slow, deliberate way of speaking caught us at the doorway. He'd overheard our conversation. He didn't exactly say, "Don't go," but he did say, "Take care after dark." The hills have long memories, and they don't always welcome new faces. We exchanged glances in mild confusion, then thanked him and left, chalking it up to local superstition. Still, it was impossible not to note that unsettled feeling that followed us all the way back to my Subaru. The drive from Athens to the campground felt shorter than I anticipated. Just as the sun started leaning west, we found ourselves winding along a narrower road, overshadowed by thick canopies of trees that let through scattered, flickering beams of light. Every so often, we would catch glimpses of the gorge walls or signs pointing to Old Man's Cave and Cedar Falls. Marcus mentioned Lake Hope State Park as well, telling us about an abandoned iron furnace there that was supposed to be haunted by the spirits of workers who had died in accidents. He liked to collect these local horror stories the way some people collected stamps. Lila half listened, fiddling with her phone, but the coverage was spotty at best, so we each retreated into our own thoughts. I was busy trying to parse how real these legends might be. I'm an analytical person by nature. I often default to rational explanations. Wild animals, optical illusions, echoes. Anything that smacked of the supernatural felt suspect to me, but at the same time, I never entirely dismissed the possibility that something beyond rational understanding could be out there. We finally arrived at a small, somewhat secluded campground near Old Man's Cave. It wasn't the main campground, which was more touristy and better lit. Marcus had found an out-of-the-way site that required us to drive down a rough gravel path. We wanted a quieter experience, or so we claimed. When we got there, the space was deserted, a flat clearing surrounded by tall hardwoods and pines, with a fire pit in the middle that looked well used. The park ranger we'd checked in with at the main station simply said, "You'll have more privacy there," and left it at that. We set up our tents in a crescent shape around the fire pit, mine and Marcus's on one side, Sarah and Lila's on the other. The tension in the air slowly began to ease as we busied ourselves with the mundane tasks of camping, unrolling sleeping bags, staking tents, collecting firewood, Eventually, the ordinary tasks lulled us into forgetting the ominous remarks we'd heard earlier. Night descended quickly, as it often does in heavily wooded areas, and we huddled around the fire. The flickering flames danced across our faces, the sparks curling upward to disappear into the darkness overhead. Marcus regaled us with more of his folklore. Skinwalkers rumored to dwell in the forests of Appalachia, Wendigo legends from farther north, stories of ghosts of children supposedly haunting parts of Ohio. Sarah, hugging her knees close to her chest, asked him to knock it off, or at least to tone down the gruesome parts. But as much as it made her uneasy, I could see she was intrigued in that same way people can't help but stare at an accident on the highway. Lila stayed mostly silent, poking at the fire with a long branch and occasionally adding her practical commentary. "You know these are just old legends, right?" she asked. "Maybe they're based on some grain of truth, but they get exaggerated over time." Marcus shrugged, seemingly unconcerned with whether she believed him. He was enjoying the theatrics for his own satisfaction. We eventually crawled into our tents. I was tired enough that sleep came quickly, but at some point during the night, I woke up. I couldn't say exactly what stirred me. Maybe a sound, maybe just the primal sense of something off. The forest around us was quiet in that suffocating way, without the usual chorus of insects. Then I heard what sounded like a step. I propped myself up on my elbows, heart hammering. I realized Marcus was awake too, because I saw the silhouette of his head turning toward me in the faint moonlight filtering through the tent's fabric. I whispered, "Did you hear that?" And he nodded. We waited, not daring to move. Another step, dry leaves and twigs crackling underfoot, circling around the campsite. Could have been a deer or a raccoon, sure, but something about the pace sounded almost human. I don't know how long we held our breath, but the steps eventually faded away. We heard one loud snap of a twig, then silence, and we both exhaled. The next morning, we all compared notes. Lila hadn't heard anything, but Sarah had. She said she thought she heard footfalls brushing against the tents. She even recalled hearing a soft exhalation, like someone, was breathing outside. Marcus went off on his usual speculation about how this could be the local cryptid or some spirit. I tried to console Sarah by saying it was likely an animal rummaging around. The rational explanation, though, didn't do much to settle her nerves. She asked if we should leave, but we'd paid for a few nights, and I admit I was also too prideful to run off over some suspicious noises in the middle of the night. Lila agreed that we should stay, so Sarah relented. We decided to go for a day hike to clear our heads and see some of the scenic spots. Maybe it would distract us from our uneasy first night. We trekked along one of the more popular trails leading toward Old Man's Cave, crossing wooden bridges over small waterfalls and ducking through carved rock tunnels. The surroundings were undeniably beautiful. Towering cliffs, striated rock faces, and luscious greenery everywhere. Marcus started cracking jokes about how we probably weren't going to see anything more threatening than a lost raccoon. Even Sarah seemed a bit lighter, though she stuck close to me, occasionally slipping her arm in mine to keep herself balanced, or maybe just for reassurance. The place was full of day hikers, families with dogs, couples snapping photos. It was almost enough to make us forget the weirdness of the night before. But then we ventured off onto a less traveled side path. I'm not even sure we were supposed to be there. It wasn't marked, and the terrain became rockier and more vertical. We passed a battered old sign that said, "Restricted," in faded letters, half covered by creepers. Marcus, of course, insisted this was where we'd find something interesting. The deeper we went, the more isolated it felt. Eventually, we found a small cave that looked less like the well-known Old Man's Cave and more like a hidden crevice in the rocks. There was a strong, foul smell emanating from the entrance, like rotting leaves, but also something more pungent. Lila, always the pragmatic one, said, "Maybe we shouldn't go in there. Might be a den for some animals." But Marcus was already stepping inside. Sarah hesitated, clearly not wanting to stand at the entrance alone, so we all followed. The cave wasn't very deep, just a big hollow in the rock. But the moment we clicked on our flashlights, I caught sight of something that made my stomach turn. In the dirt were charred sticks arranged in a triangular pattern, with a few small bones, squirrel or rabbit I couldn't tell, stacked in the center. There were also signs of a fire once being lit inside, though it looked old. Marcus crouched down, shining his flashlight on the charred area, remarking, "Looks like some kind of ritual." He said it with the delight of a child discovering a secret. Sarah made a pained expression and took a step back. Lila looked around the walls, which were blackened in places, like from candle soot. I felt a chill, an inexplicable sense that we'd intruded where we shouldn't. The smell intensified the longer we stayed there, and it was making me slightly nauseous. Then, from somewhere deeper in the cave, we heard a sound, something like a click or a tap, possibly a rock shifting. That was enough for Sarah to whisper, "Let's go." I backed her up, saying we'd seen enough. Marcus looked reluctant, but eventually he nodded, and we left, heading back toward the main trails with a sense of quiet dread following us like a shadow. When we returned to camp, the sun was still high, but the tension among us was palpable. Sarah asked me if I thought the arrangement in the cave meant someone local was doing bizarre ceremonies. I tried to shrug it off as teenage vandalism or pranks, but I could hear the uncertainty in my own voice. We spent the rest of the afternoon gathering firewood, cooking an early dinner, and checking in with each other about how we felt. Marcus joked about seeing if we could summon the forest spirit. Lila rolled her eyes, and Sarah begged him not to. I told Marcus, "Stop messing around with that stuff," and he said, "Relax, I'm joking," even though he had a strange glint in his eye. Night came again, darker than the first, perhaps because the sky was overcast. We built up the fire, hoping to keep the area well lit. The conversation was lighter at first. We talked about future trips, about possibly visiting Lake Hope next time. Sarah mentioned wanting to see the old iron furnace, since it was rumored to be haunted, but then she caught herself and laughed. I guess I'm a glutton for punishment. She seemed more at ease in that moment, as though the weird cave discovery had turned into just another odd anecdote. The hours passed, we snacked on s'mores, and for a brief stretch, it felt like a normal camping trip. But eventually, tiredness overcame us, and we decided to turn in. This time I found myself struggling to fall asleep, replaying the day's events in my head, and trying to remind myself there was nothing supernatural going on. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of Sarah's voice calling my name. "Evan! Evan!" It was frantic, echoing through the woods. My eyes shot open. Marcus was snoring softly beside me. I unzipped the tent, heart pounding. The night air was cold against my face, and the only light came from the dying embers of our fire. "Sarah?" I whispered. I heard her voice again. "Evan, help!" But it sounded distant, like she was somewhere deep among the trees. I looked across the campsite and saw Sarah's silhouette near her tent, apparently unzipping her own flap. Confused, I called out, "Sarah, are you okay?" She turned her head to me. Her own voice came out, quiet yet alarmed. "I didn't say anything, but I heard you calling me." Now I was truly disoriented, because I heard a voice that I swore was hers, and she claimed to hear a voice that sounded like me. Marcus stirred awake behind me, muttering, "What's going on?" I told him we heard something mimicking our voices. The fear in my chest was real then. I reminded myself that we were near rock formations and caves, which could cause echoes. But this was different. It was an exact imitation, a perfect mimic, not a distorted echo. Then Lila poked her head out of her tent, eyes wide, asking if one of us had been calling for her, because she swore she heard her name too. Marcus stepped out, looking more annoyed than frightened at that point. But once he registered our expressions, a serious line appeared across his forehead. He said, "Could be someone messing with us." So we gathered our flashlights to check the perimeter. We ventured a few yards into the trees, the darkness seeming to swallow our weak beams of light. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath our shoes. Every time the wind rustled a branch, I felt a spasm of panic, half expecting some figure to jump out from behind a trunk. Sarah walked close to me, breathing shallowly. We found no sign of footprints, but the ground was littered with leaf debris, making it impossible to be sure if anyone had been there. After a tense 15 minutes, we returned to camp, uncertain but unwilling to wander further and get lost. We decided to stoke the fire, remain close, and wait until morning. None of us slept well after that. When dawn finally came, the relief was palpable. The early sunlight and the faint chirping of birds gave us a semblance of normalcy again. But Sarah had dark circles under her eyes, and even Marcus seemed subdued. Lila, typically the calmest of the bunch, unzipped her tent and immediately started packing. Without missing a beat, she said, "I'm done. Something's off here, guys, and I don't want to stick around to find out what it is." She was normally a trooper, so to see her that rattled made me realize we might really be in over our heads. Sarah agreed, nodding vigorously. I felt torn. Part of me wanted to leave immediately, but another part was stubborn. The rational side argued that maybe it was a group of pranksters or some weird phenomenon we couldn't explain, but that we shouldn't be scared off. Marcus, however, was on the fence. "Let's check out a bit more today," he said. And if something else happens tonight, we bail first thing tomorrow. I was surprised Sarah didn't tear into him for that suggestion, but something in his tone suggested he wanted a final chance to see if there was any substance to his beloved legends. Lila shot him a furious look, saying we were risking our safety, but after some back and forth, we all grudgingly agreed on one more night. We planned to spend the day exploring, but return to break camp well before dark if anything else strange happened. Marcus suggested we check out another trail, or maybe drive around the region a bit. Sarah wanted to see if we could get more info from a local. I was ambivalent, but going somewhere populated seemed like a good idea for a break from the isolation. We hopped in my car and drove to a nearby overlook, the one with a tall wooden tower that hikers climb for panoramic views of the forest. We parked, climbed the tower, took in the vast sea of green below, and for a fleeting moment, it felt almost peaceful, but the tension never fully left my shoulders. I kept imagining a figure darting between the trees. We eventually moved on to a small visitor center near the main section of Hocking Hills. It was crowded with tourists asking the rangers about recommended trails. We browsed some brochures, trying not to think about the night's events. At one point, Sarah nudged me to look at a wall that displayed local legends and stories, blurbs about ghosts in the hills, sightings of half-human creatures, references to folklore that predated European settlement. I read them uneasily. The day began to slip away, and we realized we should decide whether to pack up or try another night. Marcus insisted the area around the official campgrounds was busy enough that no one would bother messing with us. Lila argued that we should switch to a more populated campsite if we were determined to stay. Sarah sided with Lila, but Marcus complained about crowds and losing our real camping experience. I tried to mediate, suggesting we at least pick a site that was still somewhat off the beaten track, but not quite as remote as the first. Eventually, compromise won out. We found a site that was further down a different trail, not the main campground, but closer to a couple of other groups. We loaded our gear, drove the short distance, and began setting up in the new spot. Night was approaching again, the sky turning a dusty pink. My nerves buzzed. The entire time we hammered tent stakes, I found myself scanning the tree line for any sign of watchers. This second campsite felt more open, with fewer towering trees. Though still surrounded by forest, we could see faint glows from other campers' fires in the distance, which gave us a sliver of reassurance. We lit our own fire and settled around it as twilight deepened. We chatted quietly, trying not to fixate on last night's terror, but the conversation kept drifting back to the mimicry. Sarah said that hearing a version of her own voice in the woods was something she'd never forget. Marcus looked thoughtful, not mocking this time, but genuinely disturbed. Lila was on edge, constantly glancing around and fiddling with her flashlight as if ready to illuminate any suspicious movement. I found myself continually rubbing my palms together, an anxious habit. A part of me wished we'd left altogether, but I also felt a gnawing curiosity. What was really out there? We tried to stay awake longer, telling ourselves that we could keep a watchful eye and maybe catch whoever or whatever was behind these antics. But as the hours stretched on, weariness overtook us. Sarah and Lila crawled into their tent first. Marcus and I stayed up for another half hour, letting the fire dwindle. We talked in low voices about the possibility of real supernatural entities. I admitted that some things defy rational explanation, but I also reminded him that people can be creative, cruel, or just plain strange. He nodded, but he seemed unconvinced. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. Once in my sleeping bag, I tried to lull myself with the comforting thought that other campers were nearby. If anything bizarre happened, at least we wouldn't be alone. I slept a few hours before the nightmares started. I dreamed of that cave with the triangular arrangement of sticks, but in my dream, the bones in the center were human-sized. I heard footsteps echoing behind me, that same whispery mimicry calling my name. When I jolted awake, it was still pitch black outside. My watch read 3:14 a.m. My heart hammered in my chest, and I strained to listen for any real sound outside the tent. It was quiet, except for the rustle of leaves in a faint breeze. Then, just as I was about to roll over and try to sleep again, I heard it, a low, raspy moan from somewhere out in the woods. It sounded neither fully human nor fully animal, like a garbled attempt at speech. My blood turned cold. I reached over to wake Marcus, only to find him already sitting up, eyes wide, finger pressed to his lips in a silent command for me not to speak. We heard the moan again. This time it rose in pitch, as though something was in pain or enraged. We both crawled quietly toward the tent flap and peered out. The remnants of the fire cast a faint glow, but beyond that was a thick wall of darkness. Then, near a distant tree, I caught a glimpse of something tall and gaunt. The shape was so oddly proportioned. Its arms seemed too long, its stance too crooked. My mind recoiled, wanting to interpret it as a trick of the light. But the shape moved. It jerked, almost as if it were learning how to walk. A branch snapped under its feet. The breeze shifted, and I detected an odor, a rancid stench reminiscent of the smell in that cave, but more potent. Marcus silently reached for his phone, likely trying to capture video, but there was hardly any light for it to be clear. I glanced toward Sarah and Lila's tent, wondering if they were still asleep. Just then, the thing in the distance snapped its head in our direction. My breath caught in my throat. Its eyes, or whatever those two pale reflective spots were, seemed to fix on us. Then it crouched and released another moan that almost sounded like a word, though garbled. My heart pounded so violently I thought I might pass out. Marcus let out a soft gasp, and I noticed he was trembling. We watched in disbelief as it retreated behind the trees, but we could still hear it, an occasional series of scraping sounds like it was dragging a limb along the ground. That's when Sarah unzipped her tent and whispered, "Evan, Marcus?" Her voice was shaky. We gestured frantically for her to keep quiet. Lila peered out from behind her, face half hidden in shadow, eyes reflecting the dying embers. Sarah mouthed, "What is that?" I shook my head, unable to provide a coherent answer. A series of hissing clicks emanated from the darkness, followed by the distant murmur of a voice calling, "Sarah." It was her name, but twisted, drawn out, as if forced through unwilling vocal cords. She clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. At that moment, the wind picked up, stirring the trees, amplifying our fear. It felt like the entire forest was alive with malevolent intent. Lila slid closer to Sarah, protectively placing an arm around her. Marcus and I exchanged desperate looks. We hadn't expected it to be so blatant. What we'd encountered wasn't just footsteps or mimicry in the distance. It was a physical presence, unnatural and horrifyingly aware of us. I finally whispered, "We need to leave. Now." Marcus nodded, swallowing hard. Sarah and Lila quickly ducked back into their tent to grab essentials. Marcus and I did the same, hastily rolling sleeping bags and throwing them into duffel bags in a flurry of movement. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage the zipper. We emerged from our tents and set about dismantling them as quietly and quickly as possible, though it felt like we were making too much noise, every rustle sounding amplified in the tense night. The moan echoed again, a little farther away now, but we were no less terrified. My gaze kept darting to the tree line, expecting that gangly silhouette to reappear at any moment. Finally, with the tents packed in a messy, haphazard manner, we snuffed out the embers of our fire with dirt and water. Our flashlights flickered, as if the batteries were dying prematurely. Marcus cursed under his breath about how they were new batteries. I found that deeply unsettling, like the environment itself was draining our resources. We started moving toward the car, staying in a tight group. The other campsites we'd thought were nearby suddenly felt leagues away, as though we'd stepped into an entirely different realm of darkness. When we were about halfway to the parking area, we heard a sharp crack from behind us, followed by heavy footsteps. We spun around to see that shape again, partially illuminated by our wavering beams of light. It stood among the trees, arms hanging at an odd angle, head tilted. For a terrifying second, I thought I saw a face, a mouth hanging open in a silent wail, cheeks sunken, skin stretched. Then, like a mirage, it vanished into the shadows. A visceral shudder ran through my body. Sarah clung to my sleeve so tightly I thought she might tear the fabric. We hurried along the trail, the night seeming thicker and more oppressively silent than it should. Marcus was in the lead, constantly sweeping his flashlight from side to side. I brought up the rear, checking behind us every few steps, terrified we'd see the creature bounding after us. The smell lingered in the air, that rancid, decaying stench. Lila kept whispering, "Go, go," as if urging us to run. We resisted the urge to break into a full sprint only because the trail was uneven, and a twisted ankle could be disastrous. My heart hammered against my ribs, adrenaline surging through my veins, leaving me breathless and on the verge of panic. At last we burst into the small dirt lot where our cars were parked. Relief flooded me when I saw my Subaru's silhouette under the faint glow of the parking area's single overhead lamp. We loaded everything we could, not caring about organization. just shoving gear into the trunk and back seat. Sarah was on the verge of tears. Lila was pale and focused. Marcus was rattled but forced himself to keep it together. We heard one more guttural cry from the trees, close enough to chill our spines again. I started the engine, and the headlights snapped on, illuminating the edge of the parking lot. As we pulled away, our beams briefly captured that horrible silhouette standing at the boundary between forest and lot. Its posture was painfully contorted, arms bent at unnatural angles, eyes reflecting white like an animal's caught in a flashlight. Its mouth hung open, revealing something like teeth, but they looked too long, too jagged. Then we were accelerating, gravel spitting from our tires, and the figure disappeared in the rearview mirror. None of us spoke for a few miles. I think we were all too shocked, too wrapped in our own thoughts to form words. At some point, we hit a more major road, and I finally choked out, "What the hell was that?" My voice sounded shrill and alien to my own ears. Marcus just shook his head, staring at the dashboard. Sarah whispered that she didn't care what it was. She just wanted to leave it behind. Lila stared out the window, expression grave, as if checking to see if we were being followed by that monster. It was deep into the early morning hours by the time we found a motel with a lit vacancy sign. We checked in like 4 people who'd seen a ghost, giving curt answers to the night manager who regarded us with curious alarm. Up in the cramped motel room, we sat on the edge of the beds, the overhead light casting harsh shadows on our exhausted faces. Nobody wanted to sleep, but we were too tired to do anything else. Eventually, Sarah curled up under the covers, trembling. Lila paced for a while before exhaustion overcame her. Marcus kept staring at the drawn curtains, occasionally peeking outside to the parking lot. I tried to calm myself with rational explanations, but the memory of that figure wouldn't leave my mind. The mimicry of our voices, the rancid smell, and that unnatural movement felt undeniably supernatural. My skepticism was battered into submission by the terrifying reality of what I'd seen. The next morning, we decided we'd drive straight home. We didn't linger or try to investigate further. We didn't even bother to argue about the nature of what had happened. We just wanted to distance ourselves from it. Sarah was extremely shaken, muttering that she never wanted to camp again in her life. Lila looked nearly as pale in daylight as she had at night, her composure held together by a thin thread. Even Marcus, who typically would have been thrilled to have encountered something uncanny, wore a haunted expression. The usual banter was gone, replaced by a hollow silence that accompanied us into the car. When we stopped for fuel on the outskirts of Logan, we barely spoke to each other, only pausing to grab stale coffee and press onward. During the drive, flashes of the previous night kept flooding my mind. I replayed the moment when our headlights revealed that twisted figure for one last horrifying glance. Each time I questioned if I'd truly seen it or if my mind had conjured details in the throes of fear. But then I'd look at Marcus, see the terror etched on his face, or glance at Sarah rubbing her arms as though freezing, and I knew it wasn't a shared hallucination. Something real had stalked us there. Whatever label you put on it, Wendigo, Skinwalker, cursed spirit, or something else, it was no less terrifying, and it had spoken, or at least tried to speak, which suggested more intelligence than any wild animal. That was the part that shook me the most, the sense that this creature was aware of us, deliberately tormenting us, playing with our fear. When we finally reached the more familiar highways closer to Cleveland, I felt a marginal sense of relief, but the memory of that presence clung to me. After dropping off Marcus, then Lila, I took Sarah back to her apartment. She invited me in, too shaken to be alone, and for a few hours we just sat on her couch in silence, letting the TV run in the background with some mundane sitcom. It felt surreal to be surrounded by normalcy again. A comfortable couch, a refrigerator humming, streetlights outside. My mind kept drifting back to the hush of those woods and the stench that seemed to foretell doom. Sarah eventually dozed off, her head resting on my shoulder, tears staining her cheeks. I stared at the wall, wide awake, watching the hours tick by. In the weeks that followed, we tried to process the event in our own ways. Marcus shut down any mention of returning to that region or investigating further, which surprised me given his usual thirst for the unexplained. Lila buried herself in her work, refusing to talk about the trip. Sarah and I confided in each other about nightmares and about how certain sounds in the night, like a cat scratching on asphalt, would trigger flashbacks of footsteps circling our tent. We made an unspoken pact not to share our story widely. If we told people, we risked being labeled as delusional or attention-seeking. Besides, what could we say? That we encountered a monstrous figure with reflective eyes and a grotesquely stretched face? prowling the woods of Hocking Hills, calling out to us in distorted versions of our own voices. No, that wouldn't do anything but invite disbelief or laughter, so we kept it among ourselves, never fully acknowledging it as real or unreal, but painfully aware that we couldn't deny the impact it had on us. Sometimes I revisit the memory of that old man in Athens, the one who told us to be careful after dark because the hills have long memories. I realize now he may have known exactly how old and hungry those memories were. We'd set foot in a place we didn't understand, a land that had witnessed countless generations and had, in parts, absorbed malevolent energies or curses. That intangible darkness, whether an entity or many, still roams those forests, occasionally crossing paths with unlucky souls. When I think about the triangular arrangement in the cave and the strange symbols burned into its walls, I wonder if someone long ago summoned or awakened that thing. Or perhaps it had always been there, a shapeless predator wearing the skins of nightmares, watching, imitating, luring. Even now, back in Cleveland, safe in my apartment, with the bustle of city life all around me, I'm not entirely free of its influence. Sometimes, late at night, I'll be half asleep and hear a soft tap at my window, or a whisper that vaguely resembles Marcus's voice, or Lila's laugh, or Sarah calling my name. It's never real. I've told myself that 1,000 times, and I've never been brave enough to look outside to confirm. But I can't escape the sensation that what we encountered in Hocking Hills has branded us in some way, as if it left a mark on our spirits. I picture that twisted figure, lamp-lit eyes shining in the darkness, grinning in the knowledge that we'll never truly outrun it. Whether it remains physically bound to those forests or not, it lingers in our minds, a reminder that some mysteries are best left undisturbed, that certain legends live beyond the threshold of human understanding. I haven't been camping since. The very thought of a tent's thin walls separating me from the open night sets my nerves on edge. Sarah tries to avoid the topic altogether, and if Marcus or Lila have gone on any new outdoor adventures, they haven't mentioned it. From time to time, I'll find myself scrolling through forums or social media posts, reading about other people's bizarre encounters in the hills of Ohio. I see references to tall, emaciated silhouettes glimpsed at dawn, or strange half-human voices echoing in the gorge. Sometimes a chill runs down my spine when I find accounts that match our experience too closely. One claimed a group of hikers saw something that stood 7 feet tall, with limbs bending backwards, following them at a distance before vanishing. Another recounted the overwhelming stench that preceded sightings of the entity. Whenever I see those descriptions, my hands shake, and I force myself to stop reading. I know too well what that terror feels like. Perhaps someday I'll muster the courage to go back in broad daylight, accompanied by more people, armed with knowledge and equipment, to see if there's any tangible evidence. Claw marks on trees, footprints, video footage from others. But deep down, I suspect it wouldn't matter. Some things aren't meant to be captured or fully understood, and I can't shake the dread that if I return, it will be waiting, bigger and hungrier, ready to pry open every secret fear I possess. That's the nature of places steeped in dark history. They wait for the curious, the unwary, the bold, to wander in and confront shadows older than memory. We stumbled into that realm without realizing it. We came out changed. I still dream about it sometimes. In those dreams, the forest stretches in endless corridors of tree trunks, and each time I think I see the exit, I hear the moaning call behind me, mimicking someone I know, my mother, my childhood friend, or Sarah, and I feel compelled to look back. The figure is always just beyond sight, but its presence is palpable. I run, but the leaves tangle around my ankles, and I fall in slow motion, breath stalling in my chest as it approaches. Then I wake up, drenched in sweat, gulping air, heart skittering like a trapped bird. In the darkness of my bedroom, I remind myself I'm hundreds of miles away from Hocking Hills, that the thing can't reach me here. But no matter how many times I repeat that mantra, I can't scrub away the memory of those luminous eyes, that hiss of an almost human voice. It's burned into me, as real as any scar. Sarah and I stayed in close contact for a while, leaning on each other. We never became romantically involved, but a bond formed from shared trauma, I suppose. She tried therapy, telling me it helped her sleep better, but she found she couldn't open up to the counselor about the actual cause of her nightmares, so she'd dance around it, labeling it an experience with an attempted attacker in the woods. It frustrated her that she couldn't get a direct sense of resolution. Lila, on the other hand, immersed herself in practical matters. She studied survival guides, took a first aid course, and even enrolled in self-defense classes. I think it gave her a sense of control. Marcus withdrew, rarely responding to texts. Once he messaged me to say he'd heard a rumor about similar sightings near Lake Hope, but he ended the message with, "I'm done chasing these things." It was as if his lust for the supernatural had imploded under the weight of a real encounter he hadn't bargained for. And so life moved on, as it tends to do. Weeks became months. The vivid horror of that night dulled a bit around the edges, but it never left me, just settled deeper into my bones. I would return to my usual routines, work, weekend outings, seeing friends, and almost forget until something triggered a memory, a foul smell drifting from a dumpster, or a strange call in the distance that turned out to be just a neighbor's cat. Each time, my pulse would race and I'd tense, scanning for a shape lurking behind the tree line of the suburban street. Of course, it was never there, at least not physically, yet the fear was, and remains, real. I suppose that is what the old man in Athens meant by, "The hills have long memories." Perhaps the land itself watched us from the moment we arrived, tested our resolve. Or maybe it was something older, something that once had a human face but lost its soul in those caves, condemned to prowl the forests, whispering for companionship in the only way it knows, by stealing the voices of the living. The rational part of me balks at such an explanation, but then I remember that twisted figure and how it mimicked Sarah's voice so perfectly. No ordinary predator does that. Whatever name it goes by, we encountered it, and we have no neat scientific explanation to lay it to rest. I've tried writing about it in a journal once or twice, searching for some personal catharsis. Each time, I end up staring at the page, struggling to put the terror into words. It's never sufficient. The only solace I've found is in keeping contact with Sarah and occasionally meeting up with Lila. We don't speak about the incident unless one of us has a nightmare or a fresh wave of anxiety. Then we reassure each other, remind ourselves we're safe now. Marcus largely drifted away from our group, maybe because facing us is facing the reminder of that horrific night. I miss his old bravado, even if it was sometimes exasperating, but I can't blame him for wanting distance. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the morning, I wonder if that presence is limited to Hocking Hills, or if it's simply chosen to remain there. Is it anchored by some ancient force, some blood-deep connection to the land? Or could it one day expand its territory, sliding from forest to forest, picking up new voices like a grotesque collector of echoes? I'm not sure which possibility disturbs me more, that it might remain in those woods, waiting for the next group of naive campers, or that it could eventually roam elsewhere. Either way, I've resolved never to let my guard down in unfamiliar forests again. As I reflect on it all, I realize the real horror isn't just the monstrous figure itself. It's the sense of invasion, that something out there can slip into our reality, our safety, and unravel our sense of security so effortlessly. It can twist our own voices against us, reduce our rational minds to cowering prey. It reveals how thin the barrier is between the known and the unknowable, between everyday life and something primal that lurks in the dark corners of the earth. I learned that lesson in the hush of those Ohio woods, and I doubt I'll ever be the same. Even if I bury the memory, the echo of it remains, calling my name when I least expect it, reminding me that the land holds secrets older than reason. And I will always remember that night I glimpsed the shape that walked like a man, but wasn't one, staring at us with malevolent curiosity, as if deciding whether we were worth devouring. That single moment, that final look in the headlights before we fled, shaped the nightmares that still visit me, the same nightmares that caution me to respect what we don't understand, because sometimes it looks back, and sometimes it follows.